white millionaire gave his credit card to his black maid, but he never expected the choice to break his heart. The lake below the house behaved like polished stone in the mornings, a hard surface that went soft only after noon. On most days, Charles Whitford watched it from the terrace with coffee cooling at his elbow, the surface reflecting a sky that did not ask for patience. He had spent decades assembling this quiet, a set of properties, a set of teams, a set of silent systems that placed fresh lilies in vases and dry logs beside fireplaces. The house answered to his habits. Lights roused at footfall. Heat rose through marble with the discretion of an old butler. Orders placed themselves inside the refrigerators as if by law. He had taken care to make almost nothing necessary. One thing remained stubborn. It met him at waking like a dull instrument set on the nightstand. Grief, familiar as a wallet, heavier than currency. 9 years earlier, his wife, Evelyn, had died after the kind of fight doctors described with diagrams on glass. She had left behind a daughter who had her eyes, and a man who had her absence. The absence organized his days. It resigned him to the strange arithmetic by which large successes fail to alter essential loss. He had fixed on a symbol of what he missed, because a mind that does not find an object will invent one. For him it was a necklace, a thin chain with a moonstone drop, held in a crown of tiny diamonds. On their wedding day, the stone had hovered at Evelyn's collarbone like a soft planet. On worse days in the hospital, it had rested there with a steadiness he could not match. Shortly after her death, during a remodel, the necklace had vanished. He pursued its return, with the determination he usually saved for complicated deals. Lawyers asked questions of contractors. Private investigators traded phone calls. He scoured estate sales, combed high-security auctions, kept a drawer for false hopes. He learned what good copies cost, and what an expert can make of wishful thinking. Nothing. Years of nothing. The loss curdled. It became a short narrative he told friends who did not know where to put their sympathy. He did not lack for company. His daughter, Lily, came and went with the rhythm of a young lawyer. Staff turned the great house into an organism that regulated itself. Among them, Maria moved with a steadiness Charles had admired without ever naming. She had started 5 years earlier, introduced by an agency as dependable, discreet, and precise. Those words had proved accurate. She understood the household's temperature and adjusted it without ceremony. She anticipated storms by how the lake smelled at 5. She believed in crisp surfaces and in not disturbing photographs on a mantel, unless asked. She said little. She noticed much. She worked in the quiet the house required. On an ordinary morning, Charles stood in the kitchen and reached a decision that did not look like a decision while it happened. The breakfast room lay behind him, in a wash of soft light. Lily's casebooks marked her path to the front door. Maria polished the brass rail of the cart that held the good bottles. He took his wallet from his pocket, slid out the platinum rectangle that governed most of his transactions, and placed it on the counter between them. He told himself he was cutting through a small formality. The gesture looked simple enough, a wealthy man making an employee's errands easier. Beneath that, something else wanted practice in trust, generosity, or disruption. He could not have named it. He offered the card and suggested she use it for market purchases and for something for herself. The words left his mouth like a signature he had written thousands of times. He did not linger over them. The day went on, calls stacked, then emptied. A site visit compressed itself into an email thread. The lake shrugged into afternoon. He had trained himself to forget what he delegated. When he returned from a short walk, a small velvet box sat on the foyer table, occupying the table's center, with the quiet authority only certain objects possess. It did not announce itself, but it arranged the space around it. The flowers bent toward it. The air went patient. He lifted the lid and found the necklace he had come to think of as a rumor. The moonstone looked back at him with its old milky calm. The tiny laurel of diamonds leaned a degree south in the way he remembered and had learned to suspect in every counterfeit. A small scratch near the clasp sealed the identification like a signature inside a coat. He did not breathe. He did not need to. The body knows. When the contested object, in a long search, has come home. There was a note in the box, only an index card with a store's name and a total. The total posed as a number. It read as a verdict on the world. He imagined a basement that smelled of older metals, of failed inheritances, of paperwork becoming dust. He imagined the geometry of glass trays and grey cloth. He imagined hands passing the pendant across a counter while a small bell over the door did its tired duty. He did not need to imagine who had descended the narrow stairs into that hoarded light, who had asked questions without giving offense, who had recognized a thing that did not speak loudly for itself. The evening rewired itself around the box. Lily returned with City on her shoulders and case summaries nested in her bag. He set the velvet before her at the table after dinner. The house contracted into the radius of what the box contained. Lily understood at once. There are recognitions beyond speech. She lifted her hair. His hands shook while he fastened the clasp. He felt a weight redistribute, from the realm of the wished to the realm of the owned, from the father's private failure to the family's recovered object. Lily's relief filled the room like a third light. She went to the mirror not to admire the jewelry but to register coherence. She touched the stone as if it were a doorknob returned to a familiar room. The night returned the house to its ordinary silence. Charles sat in his study with a glass he did not need, the velvet box empty on the desk, and found that gratitude and grief pressed on the same place in the chest. He had been waiting for the thrill of triumph. What came was older and harder. He understood, too suddenly and too clearly for comfort, that the act that had restored the most important lost thing in his life had not originated with him. He had not negotiated it into existence. He had not strategized it across a line. He had extended a tool into someone else's hand, and she had used it for something he had pursued incompetently for nearly a decade. The heartbreak arrived without ceremony. It had a simple shape, a mirror that refused to flatter. In its surface he saw a man who prided himself on attention to detail and had missed certain kinds of people. He saw a household that ran because money makes systems, and within it a person who had chosen, with no promise of return, to deploy his resources for something beyond herself. He saw the difference between generosity that praised itself in the giver's head and generosity that forgot its author on purpose. In the following days he tried to name what had changed. Outwardly, his schedule went on. The accountant still sent charts disguised as explanations. The city still lifted into its day like a great machine, arguing against collapse with motion. Inside, a reordering began. He started noticing what he had previously let blur, how Mariah arrived each morning in sturdy shoes and left each evening with a paperback's corner peeking from her bag. How she folded towels so that seams spoke to each other. How she paused, briefly, daily, at the photograph of Evelyn and Lily on the stair landing, not in curiosity but in respect, a private liturgy of caretaking. He noticed that care, properly made, leaves very little trace beyond the condition of the tended thing, that it is therefore easy to miss when a life allows the tended things alone to testify. He became aware, too, of the routes he did not take. For years he had driven past blocks, where pawn shops settled into the city like second basements. He had not descended. He had never needed to. The professional world he occupied reproduced itself in rooms with windows near ceilings and artificial ferns. His errands involved private elevators and desks, designed to make decisions look heavier. The necklace had returned from a different map, one with steeper stairs, harder light, and clerks who knew the bulk weight of dreams. Someone else had done the traveling. In the laundry room one morning he watched Mariah stack shirts with practiced economy. He did not want to interrupt the work with an inquiry that made the work background to his revelation. Yet silence asked him for cowardice and he had fewer excuses to offer it. He thanked her. He used plain words and no ceremony. He told her what the return had done for Lily and for him. He offered more money, then hesitated at his own reflex. He asked about Savannah when she mentioned it. He learned that her mother ran a daycare from a living room that smelled of bleach and crayons, that a younger brother kept odd shifts, that money traveled along family lines like an underground pipe, steady, unreported. He realized how often he had thrown polite appreciation into the space where interest should live. He felt the sting of this, without asking her to soothe it. He thought about the credit card, and about invitation disguised as instrument. He thought about what it had meant to place a symbol of power on a counter and step back. He had told himself it was generous. That had been partly true. It had also been a form of ignorance. He did not know what needs pressed on Mariah's life at that hour. He did not bother to imagine them. He came close to congratulating himself for unusual trust. the mirror kept him honest. Real trust would have asked for her voice before offering permission. He could not return to the previous version of himself without effort, and even he could see that effort's obscenity. Small corrections began to accumulate. He built a fund for household and ground staff that did not travel under his name and did not present as a favor. He asked Mariah who should administer it, and listened when she recommended a woman who had made a habit of turning neighborhood contributions into workable assistance. He moved some meetings from the gloss of hotels to rooms where cigarette smoke clung under ductwork and the floor knew decades of shoes. He trained himself to stop writing the story with himself at the center whenever the temptation arose. It arose often. Lily's life adjusted in the most visible way. The necklace settled into her routine, as if it had been designed for it. She wore it with old t-shirts, and with the jacket she saved for hearings. She used it as a small anchor on mornings that arrived with the old ache close by. Now and then, in the mirror by the stairs, she would touch the stone with the absent-minded affection one extends to a childhood scar or to a reliable dog. The object had returned. Its effect was daily, cumulative, and private. Charles's heartbreak deepened into understanding rather than into a theater of regret. He studied where else money had encouraged him to mistake authorization for care. He found incidents everywhere. A nephew's tuition he had covered, without asking what the nephew wanted to study. A donation to a food bank he had announced in a room that preferred donors' names to recipients' names. A habit of permitting himself to forget people's stories once a problem was tidied. He tracked these patterns the way a doctor tracks vital signs, not to scold an organ but to prevent a failure. He did not invent a narrative in which the return of a necklace redeemed a career. He let it rephrase him instead. On afternoons when the lake's surface wrinkled under wind, he walked the perimeter and listed things he had been wrong about out loud. He found that speaking them alone, with hawks above him and gardeners at a distance reduced their power. He discovered, too, the way attention learns to stand up straighter when named. He asked staff about their families and remembered the answers without needing to check a file. He offered help with specifics when asked, not as prophecy from above but as help. He built a new habit of asking first, often. It slowed him. The slowdown kept certain kinds of accidents from happening. The story traveled the city, as stories do when they contain a detail that appeals to everyone's wish for the rare good turn. People repeated it with edits that flattered their audience. Charles heard versions that made him the architect of the find. He corrected some of them in small rooms. He ignored others and watched them bend back toward the truth without his interference. He did not present himself for recognition. He did not pretend reluctance, either. He simply continued to stand, internally, in front of the image that mattered. A staircase down to a basement shop. An index card with a sum, a pair of hands bringing home a thing a family had allowed itself to want only on anniversaries and birthdays. On the first anniversary of the necklace's return, he cooked from his wife's stained notebook, with the kind of attention one usually saves for first attempts. He brined the chicken properly. He tucked rosemary properly. The house smelled like old Sundays. He arranged the plates without fuss, and watched Lily move through rooms as if fewer corners insisted on themselves. He caught himself searching for proof that the ache had finally resigned. It had not. It had become a quieter resident, subject to the rules of the house. Winter came with the mean wind that makes big houses feel small. The lake developed its temporary skin. The terrace slept. Inside, the ordinary drama of people continued. A groundskeeper's mother fell and needed a rail installed. A houseman studied nights to sit for a certification exam. Mariah's mother visited for a week, and the living room shaped itself to the small daycare she missed. Charles observed himself observing and tried to reduce the distance. He took Mariah's mother to breakfast at a diner, where nothing on the menu seemed designed for public relations. He discovered that kindness tastes better in places built for appetite rather than display. He discovered he had journeyed very little through the city he claimed. The credit card itself changed for him. Once, it had functioned as a key to nearly everything. A wand that turned friction into acquiescence. After the necklace, it held a new meaning. Under certain circumstances, the person who holds it is not the person who knows best how to use it. He began to view the rectangle as a tool that required a story before it could do good work. He asked for stories. He accepted being the last to know, sometimes. He practiced the humility of outsourcing not only tasks, but decisions. Lest this sound like a sermon that ends in a sweeping cure, it should be said that he failed often in small ways. Habit kept returning with its suitcase. He still entered rooms expecting them to arrange themselves around his objectives. He still mistook speed for competence. He still received credit for work he had not done, and sometimes failed to redirect it quickly enough. The difference lived in what he did after noticing. He stopped letting shame perform and instead moved the credit to the right person with an urgency that surprised people who had long since stopped expecting such transfers. If anyone had asked him to define heartbreak in the months after the necklace returned, he would have offered a practical definition. It was the feeling of discovering that you are not the protagonist of the most important event in the life you supervise, and then deciding to be relieved rather than insulted. It was the feeling of understanding that money, in the absence of attention, has a tendency to congratulate itself and call that virtue. It was the feeling of holding an empty velvet box, and knowing it had emptied you of a certain vanity, and filled you, against your will, with a different hunger. The hunger to see your life accurately, and to act on that seeing, without applause. The house, for its part, learned to hold a softer kind of order. People became less invisible inside it. Schedules continued, but the edges rounded. The photographs on the stairs acquired a new neighbor. Not a portrait, but a small, framed scrap from Evelyn's recipe notebook, with grease marks, like fingerprints. The necklace, small as it was, gathered a community around itself, those who had looked, those who had not known how to look, those who now knew where to look next time. Years from that morning, when Charles walked the lakeshore in a light that felt earned rather than purchased, he would think of the chain and stone, not as a recovered asset, but as a hinge on which his interior life had turned. He would remember how quickly his hand had offered the credit card and how little he had expected of the gesture. He would remember the foyer table with its velvet square and the knowledge that flooded through him like a debt finally called in. He would remember the face of his daughter in the mirror, her hand at her throat, and how it felt to stand in the doorway and accept that the most meaningful correction of a long-standing wound had arrived through the attention of someone he had employed for years without understanding the breadth of her regard. He would not romanticize the hierarchy that placed them in a house together under such terms. He would not pretend it became a friendship or a fable. He would describe it, if pressed, as an agreement older than contracts. One person paying attention on behalf of another, and not needing to be named the author of the result. If he had to credit anyone, he would credit attention itself for being the only currency that increases in value when shared. In a desk drawer he kept the index card from the pawn shop, not as a trophy but as a simple ledger entry of how the necklace had re-entered their lives, down a narrow flight of stairs, across a counter scuffed by years of commerce, paid for with a rectangle of permission, carried home by hands that had chosen to use permission on behalf of someone else's grief. He looked at the card now and then when the day's meetings made him feel efficient. It steadied him by reminding him what efficiency never rescues. If there is a moral worth writing down, it is too small to ornament. Give a tool to someone who lives closer to the ground you claim to care about, and accept that they will build something you could not have sketched. Learn to be undone by the good you did not orchestrate. Call that undoing, a beginning rather than a loss. Let the ache stay. It will teach you where you were blind. The lake kept its seasonal bargains. The house aged into its materials. The daughter kept moving through her life with a small moon at her throat. The maid, who was not reducible to the word the agency used for her, continued to work in a manner that made the house feel inhabited rather than serviced. And the rich man left with his cards, his accounts, his careful projects carried a new, unwelcome, necessary awareness. The best thing that had happened under his roof in a decade had not required his management, only his willingness to lose authorship. He had given away an instrument, without thought. She had returned a family, its missing piece. He understood, at last, why the moment had broken his heart. It had shifted the story he told himself, about what his wealth could accomplish, and about who in his world understood, which doors opened onto which rooms. The pain came from a tear in the old narrative. The relief came from letting the new one replace it. A man with every resource learns that the resource he lacked was not money but the habit of seeing the lives near his own as capable of choosing better than he could. He learned, and the necklace hung where it belonged, a small moon in a house that had finally admitted it revolved around more than one star.